On a quiet night in September 2022, something invisible but irreversible happened beneath the cold waters of the Baltic Sea. No missiles, no sirens, no declaration of war. Just pressure, steel, and an explosion so precise it could only have been intentional. Within hours, Europe's most important gas artery was bleeding bubbles to the surface. Nord Stream was gone. And here's what nobody tells you. This was not just an attack on infrastructure. It was an attack on certainty, on assumptions, on the idea that energy systems built over decades could not be erased in a single moment. Here's why this matters. When pipelines explode without attribution, power doesn't disappear. It changes hands. This is where the pattern begins. Europe's dependence on Russian gas was not an accident. It was constructed deliberately over half a century. In the 1970s, as oil shocks rattled Western economies, the Soviet Union offered Europe something that looked stable: long-term gas supply through fixed infrastructure. Pipelines meant commitment. Steel meant permanence. Even during the Cold War, gas flowed uninterrupted from east to west. Trust was embedded underground. By the time Nord Stream 1 became operational in 2011, that trust had matured into dependence. Germany alone built an industrial model calibrated to cheap, continuous Russian gas. At first, it looked like a miracle. Then the bill arrived. Nord Stream was not just a pipeline. It was leverage disguised as cooperation. Two parallel lines running directly from Russia to Germany under the Baltic Sea, bypassing transit states, politics, and friction. Capacity exceeded 55 billion cubic meters per year. Enough to power factories, heat cities, and anchor Europe's largest economy. Critics warned of over-reliance. Supporters dismissed them as alarmists. Everyone thought they were safe. They weren't. The danger wasn't what they saw. It was what they ignored: the irreversible nature of infrastructure dependency. By the late 2010s, Nord Stream had become more than energy. It was a geopolitical fault line. Eastern European nations warned it weakened their security. The United States argued it increased Russian leverage. Germany insisted it was purely economic, not power, trade. But pipelines do not care about intentions. They create incentives, and incentives shape behavior. Then came 2022. Russia's invasion of Ukraine shattered Europe's energy assumptions overnight. Gas flows slowed, prices surged, governments scrambled. Nord Stream 2, completed but not certified, was frozen indefinitely. Nord Stream 1 became a bargaining chip, then a question mark. Supply dropped to zero, but the pipes still existed. The option remained, and options are power, until they aren't. When the explosions ripped through Nord Stream in September, they didn't just disable infrastructure. They eliminated possibility. Let me show you exactly how this changes the strategic landscape. A pipeline that exists but is idle preserves optionality. A pipeline that is destroyed does not. The sabotage transformed a reversible standoff into a permanent condition. No negotiation could restore the flow. No political shift could reopen the valve. The decision space collapsed. And that's the point. Within hours, gas prices spiked. Insurance markets reevaluated risk. European leaders issued cautious statements. No one rushed to assign blame. Analysts suggested multiple actors had both capability and motive. Russia denied involvement. Western governments avoided accusations. Investigations stalled. Silence filled the gap. And in silence, incentives speak louder than statements. Here's what nobody tells you. In modern geopolitics, destroying infrastructure can be more decisive than capturing territory. Territory can be retaken. Infrastructure, once destroyed underwater at that depth, takes years to repair, if it is ever repaired at all. The sabotage didn't just interrupt gas flows, it rewrote Europe's energy future in an instant. Consider the timing. By September 2022, Nord Stream was already politically toxic, but it still represented leverage, especially for Germany. A frozen option is still an option. Its destruction removed ambiguity. It forced commitment. Europe could no longer pretend it might return to Russian gas under different circumstances. The bridge was not burned. It was detonated. Not disruption. Irreversibility. Markets understood this immediately. Prices reacted not to loss of supply. gas wasn't flowing anyway, but to loss of flexibility. The difference matters. Flexibility absorbs shocks, rigidity amplifies them, and Europe had just lost its largest flexibility valve. Who benefits from that? That question hangs at the center of this story, unresolved and uncomfortable. Some analysts argue Russia had little to gain by destroying its own leverage. Others counter that leverage unused can become liability. A pipeline that Europe might one day reopen undermines the credibility of long-term separation. Destroying it locks in the new reality. Other analysts suggest rival suppliers benefited: LNG exporters, alternative pipeline routes, energy traders. Still, others point to strategic messaging, demonstrating that undersea infrastructure is vulnerable changes global calculations far beyond gas. The danger wasn't the explosion itself, it was the precedent. Undersea cables, pipelines, energy arteries, data lines. Modern civilization runs through invisible networks laid quietly beneath water and soil. Nord Stream exposed how fragile those systems are and how deniable attacks on them can be. No uniforms, no flags, no claims, just consequence. This is where the psychological dimension emerges. Fear does not require proof. It requires plausibility. Once markets accept that critical infrastructure can be destroyed without attribution, risk premiums rise everywhere. Insurance costs increase. Investment hesitates. Governments harden positions. Trust erodes. The sabotage sent a signal far larger than the pipeline itself, and the signal was simple. Nothing is guaranteed. For Europe, the loss was immediate and structural. Germany accelerated LNG terminals. Industries shut down or relocated. Energy prices reshaped competitiveness. Some sectors adapted, others didn't. The industrial model that had defined Europe for decades cracked under pressure. Not collapse. Transformation. Forced, expensive, irreversible. But this story is not just about Europe. It's about a new phase of power where denial matters more than declaration, and outcomes matter more than attribution, where benefits accrue not to those who act loudly, but to those who quietly reshape the field. Which brings us to the question only Section 2 can answer. If no one claims responsibility for destroying one of the most important energy arteries on Earth, who gains from a world where that artery can never be used again? When infrastructure disappears, motives become clearer than confessions. Here's what nobody tells you. In modern power struggles, the question is no longer who did it, but who no longer has a choice. The Nord Stream sabotage didn't need attribution to succeed. Its effect was automatic. It removed options. And removing options is one of the most powerful moves in geopolitics. Here's why this matters. When energy pathways are erased, alliances harden, markets reprice risk, and strategic trajectories lock into place, regardless of intent. This is where the pattern begins to show its deeper logic. Before the blasts, Europe lived in ambiguity. Russian gas was politically frozen but physically intact. That ambiguity mattered. It allowed politicians to posture, markets to hedge, and industries to delay irreversible decisions. After the blasts, ambiguity vanished. The system snapped from reversible tension to permanent separation. Not escalation. Commitment. Let me show you exactly how sabotage reshapes incentives without firing a shot. A functioning pipeline creates leverage for both sides. The supplier can threaten cuts, the buyer can threaten diversification. A destroyed pipeline eliminates mutual leverage and replaces it with asymmetry. One side loses a market forever. The other loses a supplier forever. The conflict shifts from negotiation to adaptation. In that shift, different actors gain and lose in uneven ways. Some analysts suggest that the most immediate beneficiaries were alternative suppliers. Liquefied natural gas exporters, particularly those with flexible cargoes, found themselves in a structurally tighter market. Prices rose, contracts lengthened, investment accelerated. This wasn't opportunism, it was gravity. When a major artery disappears, flows reroute through whoever remains connected, not favoritism. Physics. Others point to transit states and alternative pipeline routes that regained relevance overnight. Capacity that once seemed marginal became strategic. Storage facilities became bargaining chips. infrastructure that survived the blast radius inherited value simply by existing. The world learned again that resilience is often accidental, and scarcity rewards whoever happens to be in place when the map changes. But the largest gains may not be economic at all. They may be psychological. The sabotage normalized a new threshold, deniable attacks on critical infrastructure in peacetime. The danger wasn't what they saw. It was what they ignored, the quiet recalibration of norms. If pipelines can be destroyed without triggering open conflict, then every undersea cable, every energy corridor, every data line becomes a question mark. Insurance models change, naval postures adjust, investment timelines stretch, risk becomes ambient. This is where the mechanism reveals itself. Strategic ambiguity functions like a solvent. It dissolves old assumptions without replacing them with new guarantees. No actor needs to claim responsibility to benefit. The benefit accrues to the environment itself, a world more cautious, more fragmented, more expensive to operate within. And in that world, those with redundancy, capital, and control over alternatives gain relative advantage. Who loses? Those who built efficiency on singular pathways. Those who optimized for cost over resilience. Those who assumed continuity was safer than redundancy. Europe's industrial model was one of those. Cheap gas enabled scale. Scale enabled competitiveness. Competitiveness masked fragility. At first, it looked like a miracle. Then the bill arrived. Some economists argue the sabotage accelerated a transition Europe was already undertaking. Forced diversification, accelerated renewables, rapid LNG build-out. There is truth there. But acceleration is not the same as optimization. Forced moves are expensive moves. Capital reallocates under duress. Errors multiply. The cost of capital rises. Households absorb shocks through prices, and political systems absorb shocks through polarization. Transformation, yes, but at a premium. Now consider deterrence. A visible attack with a clear perpetrator invites response. A deniable attack invites recalculation. The Nord Stream event did not trigger escalation precisely because attribution remained murky. Analysts suggest this ambiguity is the point. It keeps the conflict below thresholds while achieving irreversible outcomes. Not victory. Lock-in. And lock-in has consequences. Once Europe committed to non-Russian gas, the long-term architecture changed. Contracts extended 10, 15, 20 years. Infrastructure investments hardened pathways that will outlast the crisis. Emissions trajectories shifted. Industrial geography shifted. These are not temporary responses. They are path dependencies created by a single night under the Baltic Sea. Here's the trap. When infrastructure becomes a target, redundancy becomes mandatory. But redundancy costs money. It slows efficiency. It raises prices. Over time, consumers pay more not because energy is scarce, but because security is expensive. The world becomes safer in one sense and poorer in another, and the actors best positioned in that world are those with capital depth and political stability, those who can afford redundancy. This leads to the uncomfortable beneficiary that rarely gets named: uncertainty itself. Volatility rewards traders, not producers. Arbitrage thrives where predictability dies. When pipelines disappear, spreads widen. Optionality becomes valuable. Those who can move quickly across markets gain. Those who require long-term certainty lose. The sabotage widened that gap. But there is a deeper psychological benefit at play. The destruction of Nord Stream removed a pressure relief valve inside European politics. As long as the pipeline existed, debates about reopening it could resurface during price spikes or political shifts. Its destruction ended those debates. Not consensus. Finality. That finality simplified policy at the cost of flexibility. Some analysts argue that this clarity, however painful, was itself a strategic gain for certain actors who wanted Europe decisively aligned, not hedging. Consider the message to the rest of the world. If critical infrastructure can be eliminated without attribution, then protection becomes a permanent concern. States invest more in surveillance, patrols, and security. Budgets shift from growth to guarding. the peace dividend shrinks. And when guarding becomes normal, the threshold for disruption lowers. This is where the pattern begins to repeat itself across domains. Energy today, data tomorrow, finance next. The scenarios ahead are conditional, but their contours are visible. In one scenario, norms harden. Infrastructure protection becomes multilateral. Attacks become rarer because defenses improve. The system absorbs the lesson and stabilizes at a higher cost. In another scenario, deniable sabotage proliferates. Insurance retreats, projects delay, fragmentation deepens. The global economy slows under the weight of permanent risk premiums. In a third scenario, escalation occurs, not immediately but cumulatively, as repeated incidents force attribution and response. None are guaranteed. All are plausible. Here's why this matters beyond Europe. The Nord Stream sabotage demonstrated that power can be exercised by subtraction rather than addition. By removing a capability, the field changes. No troops required. No declarations made. The world wakes up different. This is not new in history, but it is newly efficient. And now, the question of beneficiaries becomes clearer without naming names. Those who benefit are the ones whose preferred future became unavoidable. Those who lose are the ones who depended on optionality. The event favored actors aligned with permanence over flexibility, with redundancy over efficiency, with fragmentation over integration. Here's what nobody tells you. The most powerful outcome of the sabotage was not economic. It was cognitive. It taught governments, markets, and citizens to think differently about infrastructure, to assume vulnerability, to price fear. Once that mindset takes hold, it does not easily reverse. Not peace, preparation, not certainty, caution, not integration, insulation. The Nord Stream pipelines now lie silent, twisted metal on the seabed. They are not just ruins, they are reminders of how quickly decades of planning can be erased, of how power can be exercised invisibly, of how benefits accrue not to those who speak the loudest, but to those who quietly shape the landscape in which others must act. And in that landscape, the most important question is no longer who did it. It's who no longer gets to choose.